Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's hearing titled Gulf War: What Kind of Care Are Veterans Receiving 20 Years Later? Yes, it has been over 20 years since the Gulf War. I remember very well, having been there myself as a Marine Corps officer. Now, as chairman of this subcommittee, I am asking the same questions many fellow Gulf War veterans have, namely, how is this unique set of veterans being treated by the VA? Well, it may be pretty easy to determine whether a veteran served in the Gulf War. It has been difficult for some time to accurately identify what constitutes Gulf War illness. However, a lot of people, both in the veteran community and the medical community, agree that it exists. In fact, VA's current Chief of Staff, John Gingrich, once made the following comment about Gulf War illness, quote, "While commanding an artillery battalion during the Gulf War I, one of my soldiers suddenly became quite ill. Despite the best efforts of our medical team, they could not diagnose what made him so sick. Out of 800 soldiers under my command, no one else was that sick. Now, here we are, almost 20 years later, and this veteran is still suffering, and has been since the war. I have watched him when he could barely stand up, couldn't cross the room on his own. His legs were so weak. He has been in and out of hospitals many times, seen by some of the best doctors, and yet there is no explanation for his debilitating illness. And this veteran is not alone," unquote. Chronic multi-symptom illness, or CMI, is by its own definition not just one item that a VA physician can look for. However, there are certain things a VA physician can and should look for in determining whether a veteran likely has CMI that can be attributed to service in the first Gulf War. This should be a straightforward process. However, I'm concerned that it is not happening in practice. This hearing today is not about whether Gulf War illness exists. This hearing is about how it is identified, diagnosed, and treated, and how the tools put in place to aid these efforts have been used. For example, is the Gulf War Registry working as intended and being used properly? If not, what is VA doing to fix the problem? And what can this committee do to help VA in that effort? Are the findings of the Research Advisory Committee being put to use in identifying, diagnosing, and treating those veterans suffering from Gulf War illness? If not, where is the disconnect? How can this committee help VA better assist these veterans? We have learned a lot in the last 20 years. Science and research has identified unique medical issues for the veterans of the Gulf War and established baselines from which we can gain a better understanding of those unique issues. Gulf War illness has significant physical effects on the lives and well-being of those veterans, and we need to make sure that VA can and does make every effort to accurately identify, diagnose, and treat them in a timely fashion. To be sure, it should not take another 20 years for us all to get this right. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses on what is working in treating Gulf War illness, where problems remain, and how the entire process can be improved. With that, I yield to Ranking Member Kirkpatrick for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because we know that the deployment experience of our veterans is especially important in the world of research and the care and treatment of injuries and illnesses, I want to thank you for holding this hearing on Gulf War veterans and the progress or not of recognizing and treating these veterans for ill-defined and undiagnosed conditions. It is estimated that up to 35% of veterans who have served in the Gulf War suffer from symptoms that are not readily identifiable or well understood. In the Institute of Medicine's report released just this past January, and on which this hearing is based, these conditions are called chronic multi-symptom illness, or CMI. Veterans from the 1991 Gulf War have struggled for more than 2 decades to dispel the all too often accusation that it's all in your head. Veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have recently presented to the Veterans Health Administration with similar symptoms and have joined their fellow veterans in the fight for effective treatments and legitimate recognition of CMI by providers. Keeping the struggle of this generation of veterans in the forefront of this subcommittee is not just important, but crucial for us as a nation to finally look at service in combat not so narrowly as just that span of time served in combat, but to look at the whole experience of the service member from the perspective of pre-deployment, deployment, and post-deployment as the sum total of things that have happened to a service member. Hopefully this hearing will provide us a better perspective and a more holistic approach in understanding their unique needs and the full toll that serving takes on everyone. In this way, we are better able to contribute to their healing and readjustment. I think it is incumbent upon us to learn as much as we can about what our nation is asking for our service members and families when they volunteer and raise their right hand. We must recognize and be prepared to address the consequences of that service and bring to bear our best efforts to ensure that they are thoroughly prepared to serve, and when they return home, we commit to making them whole again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. I ask that all members waive their opening remarks as per this committee's custom and invite the first panel to the witness table. I see you there. On this panel, we will hear from Dr. Leah Steele, Research Professor of Biomedical Studies and Director of the Veterans Health Research Program at Baylor University, Dr. Stephen S. Coughlin, Adjunct Professor of Epidemiology at Emory University, Dr. Bernard M. Rossoff, Chairman of the Board of Directors at Huntington Hospital and Chair of the Committee of Gulf War and Health, Treatment for Chronic Multi-Symptom Illness at the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies. And finally, from Mr. Anthony Hardy, a Gulf War veteran himself. All of your complete written statements will be made part of the hearing record. Dr. Steele, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Medical Studies at Baylor, where I direct a multidisciplinary research program on the health of Gulf War veterans with scientists from across the country. I've also served on several federal committees that plan and advise government agencies on Gulf War research, including the Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans Illnesses, which we commonly call the RAC. I've been asked to testify on the work of federal agencies in addressing Gulf War illness. By this, we mean the serious, often disabling symptom complex resulting from military service in the 1991 Gulf War. I want to be clear, Gulf War illness refers to a characteristic profile of symptoms: persistent cognitive and neurological problems, widespread pain, respiratory and other concurrent symptoms that are not explained by established medical or psychiatric diagnoses. In recent years, the government has made progress understanding Gulf War illness, but there remain serious problems on a number of fronts at VA, including the need for adequate health care for Gulf War veterans. 22 years after the war, we know Gulf War illness is not a stress-induced or psychiatric disorder. Rates of PTSD, for example, were much lower in the 1991 Gulf War veterans than in veterans from other wars. And studies consistently show that Gulf War illness is not due to war trauma or serving in combat. Rather, studies identify links with a number of hazardous exposures during the war. And there is no disagreement among scientists working in this area that Gulf War illness is a real and serious problem, affecting 25 to 33% of the nearly 700,000 veterans who served in that war. Further, few veterans have recovered in the 22 years since the war, unfortunately. This is an incredibly important time for Gulf War illness research. Scientific advances have provided important insights into this problem, its causes, and the biological processes that drive veterans' symptoms. At the same time, results are beginning to come in from treatment studies that show benefits for veterans with Gulf War illness, with more treatment research in the pipeline and more results expected in the near term. After so many years of waiting, there is finally some hope for Gulf War veterans. Hope that they will have answers that are long overdue, and hope that treatments can be found that meaningfully improve their health and their lives. Those of us most involved in this research believe, based on recent progress, that these successes are within sight. But I regret to say that in some sectors within VA, there appears to have been backward movement, with actions that seem intended to ignore the science and minimize this condition as a problem. Fundamentally, we have a situation where two federal agencies sponsor very different scientific programs, both ostensibly to address Gulf War health issues. DoD's Gulf War Illness Research Program is managed by the Office of Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs, or CDMRP. This office has made great strides in a short time, with about $34 million in funding over 5 years between 2006 and 2011. This program began in 2006 by defining a mission, establishing priorities, and enlisting the input and guidance of experts in the field and veteran stakeholders. This mission-oriented approach has yielded impressive progress, and the proof is in the results. The highest priority research for Gulf War illness are studies to identify effective treatments. Of the 50 projects approved for CDMRP funding between 2006 and 2011, 18 are treatment-related, 11 clinical studies to assess treatments for ill veterans, and additional research on treatments in animal models of Gulf War illness, a very impressive record. In contrast to DoD's mission-oriented approach, VA has not managed an effective program that achieves targeted priorities for Gulf War veterans. Research programs at VA often run counter to the advice of scientific experts. The proof, again, is in the results. VA has reported spending over $120 million for Gulf War research over the 10 years between 2002 and 2011. This includes a total of just 5 human and animal projects related to treatment for Gulf War illness, 2 focused on stress reduction. So what happened? The devil is often in the details, of course, but there are 2 overarching themes. First, VA has been slow to clearly and accurately acknowledge the Gulf War illness problem. VA continues to provide mixed signals and vague or inaccurate representations concerning the reality and the nature of Gulf War illness. This generic representation of the Gulf War illness problem as a constellation of disparate symptoms that overlap considerably with psychiatric disorders provided the basis for the recent IOM report on treatments, which others on the panel will be talking about. Unfortunately, the misrepresentation of Gulf War illness by VA was amplified in this report, but we'll hear more about that later. There are many examples, large and small, of VA minimizing the Gulf War illness problem. It is unbelievable, for example, that VA's current national study of Gulf War veterans, conducted in 2013, does not even assess Gulf War illness symptoms. This is the largest study of 1991 Gulf War veterans in the U.S. and targets 30,000 veterans. It includes scores of questions in many areas like psychological stress, substance abuse, and alternative medicine, but not the basic symptoms needed to define Gulf War illness by any case definition. This is a wasteful and inexcusable missed opportunity at best, and something akin to scientific malpractice at worst. Further, VA has never established an effective research program to address priority Gulf War health issues. There are 2 main reasons that I can talk about here, although many countless examples might be provided. First, VA's program has been scientifically ineffective. Despite strong urging from scientific experts, VA did not begin the process of developing a strategic plan for Gulf War research until 20 years after the war. A comprehensive process was finally undertaken in 2011 to develop such a plan with non-government experts and stakeholders from multiple institutions and offices, 9 groups of at least 6 members each, working over many months to craft and review the plan. The draft plan was largely approved by 2 expert committees early in 2012, but in the next several months, the plan was extensively changed by VA internal editors, who removed references to Gulf War illness and substantially altered the program developed to define and treat this problem. The Federal Research Advisory Committee on which I serve had long urged VA to develop a plan of this type, but last June the RAC withdrew its support of the plan and reported to the Secretary that under current circumstances the committee had no confidence in VA's ability to develop an effective Gulf War research program. And just one final point, briefly. The other major issue related to VA's Gulf War research program relates to research funding. The RAC was charged by Congress to review all federal research programs that address Gulf War health issues. Our committee staff review of Gulf War research expenditures each year invariably finds that a large portion of VA-identified Gulf War studies would not be considered Gulf War research by any other government or non-government program. This is not a trivial problem. In many years, 60% or more of the millions of dollars identified for Gulf War research is actually used for other types of research, with no link in any important respect to 1991 Gulf War veterans. There are far too many examples to identify here, but they include high-dollar research items, like the $10 million used to fund a post-mortem brain tissue bank identified as the Gulf War Biorepository Trust. In reality, this program is a brain bank for veterans with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Despite its name and the $10 million in Gulf War funding used for this program, it neither targets nor studies Gulf War veterans in any important way. As of 2010, only one of the 60 contributors to this brain bank was a Gulf War veteran. So, as always, the proof is in the results. Together, VA's poor representation of the Gulf War illness problem and failure to apply current scientific knowledge to develop a focused, state-of-the-art research program have led to relatively little in the way of tangible benefits for ill veterans. From my perspective as a scientist who has worked in this area for many years, it is time to get this right. And certainly the many thousands of veterans who have suffered with Gulf War illness for more than 20 years would say it is long past time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Steele. Dr. Coughlin.
Chairman Kaufman and members of the subcommittee, distinguished guests, thank you for the privilege of testifying today. I'm Steve Coughlin. I've worked as an epidemiologist for over 25 years, including positions as a senior cancer epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and as associate professor of epidemiology and director of the program in public health ethics at Tulane University. I chaired the writing group that prepared the ethics guidelines for the American College of Epidemiology and have authored or edited several key texts on public health ethics and epidemiology. For the past 4.5 years, I was a senior epidemiologist in the Office of Public Health at the Department of Veterans Affairs. In December 2012, I resigned my position in the U.S. Civil Service because of serious ethical concerns that I'm here to testify about today. The Office of Public Health conducts large studies of the health of American veterans. However, if the studies produce results that do not support the Office of Public Health's unwritten policy, they don't release them. This applies to data regarding adverse health consequences of environmental exposures, such as burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, and toxic exposures in the Gulf War. On the rare occasions when embarrassing study results are released, data are manipulated to make them unintelligible. The 2009-2010 National Health Study of a new generation of U.S. veterans targeted 60,000 OIF and OEF veterans and cost $10 million, not including the salaries of those who worked on it and were employed by the VA. 20 to 30% of these veterans were also Gulf War air veterans, and the study produced data regarding their exposures to pesticides, oil well fires, and pyridostigmine bromide pills. It also included meticulously coded data as to what medications they were taking. The Office of Public Health has not released these data or even disclosed the fact that this important information on Gulf War veterans exists. Anything that supports the position that Gulf War illness is a neurological condition is unlikely to ever be published. I co-authored a journal article for publication on important research findings from the New Generation study having to do with the relationship between exposures to burn pits and other inhalational hazards in asthma and bronchitis in OIF veterans. My immediate supervisor, Dr. Aaron Schneiderman, told me not to look at data regarding hospitalizations and doctor's visits. The tabulated findings obscure rather than highlight important associations. When I advised him I did not want to continue as a co-investigator under these circumstances, he threatened me. Speaking as a senior epidemiologist with almost 30 years of research experience, there is no reason to work night and day for years on a complex data collection effort, which costs U.S. taxpayers millions of dollars, if you're not comfortable putting your name on publications stemming from the study, or if no scientific publications are released. Another example of important data that have never been released are the results of the Gulf War Family Registry, which was mandated by Congress. These were physical examinations provided at no charge to Gulf War veterans' family members. I have been advised that these results have been permanently lost. The Office of Public Health has also manipulated information regarding veterans' health through the questions included in their surveys. During the preparation of a major survey of Gulf War Air veterans, of which I was principal investigator, the follow-up study of a national cohort of Gulf War and Gulf Air veterans, the Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Illness made extensive recommendations regarding changes to the survey. I considered many of those changes as very constructive, and some were adopted. The VA Chief of Staff, Mr. John Gingrich, directed my supervisors to send the Gulf War study scientific protocol and draft questionnaire out for additional objective scientific peer review. The OPH Chief Science Officer, Dr. Michael Peterson, contacted a longtime friend of his who is Dean of the U.S. School of Public Health. The Dean identified a faculty member at his school, although the individual has no background in Gulf War health research. My direct supervisor, Dr. Schneiderman, spoke with the peer reviewer and told him that the Research Advisory Committee comments were politically motivated, i.e. not objective in nature. The reviewer responded that he would certainly try to help out. Not surprisingly, the reviewer's comments were highly favorable. The Chief of Staff, Mr. Gingrich, was never informed that the outside reviewer worked for a friend of Dr. Peterson's. My supervisors also made false statements in writing to the Chief of Staff. For example, they falsely stated that putting the study on hold long enough to further revise the questionnaire would cost the government $1 million, delay the study for a year or longer, and potentially result in contract default. None of that was true. The contract for the study was specifically worded in a way that the contractor was only paid for each deliverable as they completed that piece of the work product. As a result, the Chief of Staff ordered the survey to proceed without the changes. The Office of Public Health also handles VA dealings with the Institute of Medicine, which is part of the National Academies of Science. Congress and VA leadership rely on the IOM for authoritative, objective information on medical science. I have personally served on IOM committees and workshops having to do with public health ethics. Last year, the Department of Veterans Affairs contracted with the IOM for a congressionally mandated study of treatments for chronic multisymptom illness in Gulf War veterans. Many Gulf War veterans were distressed that 5 speakers selected to brief the IOM committee presented the view that the illness may be psychiatric, although science has long discredited that position. My understanding is that Dr. Peterson identified the speakers the IOM should invite. I wish to close with a subject of particular importance to me. Almost 2,000 research participants from the National Health Study of a new generation of U.S. veterans self-reported that they had thoughts in the previous 2 weeks that they would be better off dead. However, only a small percentage of those veterans, roughly 5%, ever received a callback from a study clinician. Some of those veterans are now homeless or deceased. I was unsuccessful in getting senior Office of Public Health officials to address this problem in the New Generation study. I was successful in incorporating these callbacks in the Gulf War survey, and they have saved lives. But only after my supervisors threatened to remove me from the study and attempted disciplinary action against me when I appealed their refusal to provide for callbacks to a higher authority. I urge this committee to direct VA to immediately identify procedures to ensure that veterans who participate in VA large-scale epidemiologic studies receive appropriate follow-up care so that this tragedy is not repeated. I also urge you to initiate legislation to cure the epidemic of serious ethical problems in the Office of Public Health I've described to you today. In view of the pervasive pattern where some of these officials fail to tell the truth, even to VA leadership, VA cannot be expected to reform itself. These problems impact the balance of risks and benefits of federally funded human subjects research costing tens of millions of dollars and which fail to serve the interests of the veterans they are intended to benefit. The VA mental health professionals who made callbacks for the 2012 Gulf War follow-up survey were over at the VA Medical Center here in DC, saved lives and ameliorated human suffering. They help vulnerable research participants get access to health care benefits to which they are entitled to by acts of Congress. When you're suffering from a neurologic condition, such as Gulf War illness or traumatic brain injury, or a psychiatric condition, such as major depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, it can be extremely difficult to navigate the bureaucratic procedures for gaining access to health care benefits. That's why it's essential to have clinical psychologists, licensed clinical social workers, and other mental health professionals as co-investigators on these large-scale national surveys. The quality of measures to assist research participants who are experiencing pronounced psychological distress varies widely across epidemiologic studies conducted by the Department of Veterans Affairs, studies that are targeting hundreds of thousands of U.S. Servicemen and women and U.S. veterans. In some studies, such as the National Health Study for a New Generation of U.S. Veterans, only a small percentage or none of the research participants who self-report suicide ideation receive a callback from a study clinician.
I'm going to have to remind the witnesses.
This practice is unethical and should be strongly discouraged.
I'm going to have to try and remind the witnesses to try and keep it at 5 minutes. You're at 10 minutes right now. And because we're going to have to return to vote in a little while, and so we want to get through as much as we possibly can.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Bernie Rossoff. I'm chairman of the board of directors at Huntington Hospital, part of the North Shore LIJ Health System in Huntington, New York. I'm a specialist in internal medicine and gastroenterology and professor of medicine at the Hofstra North Shore LIJ School of Medicine. I also served as chair of the Institute of Medicine's Committee on Gulf War and Health, Treatment for Chronic Multi-Symptom Illness. The Institute of Medicine, or the IOM, as you know, is the health arm of the National Academy of Sciences, an independent, nonprofit organization that provides unbiased and authoritative advice to decision makers and to the public. The IOM was asked by the Department of Veterans Affairs to comprehensively review, evaluate, and summarize the scientific and medical literature regarding treatments for chronic multi-symptom illness, or, as you've heard, CMI, among Gulf War veterans. The IOM assembled an expert committee, of which I was chair, to address this task. We met in person 5 times over a 9-month period to gather evidence, deliberate on our conclusions and recommendations, and write our report. That report underwent a rigorous, independent, external review before being released in January of this year. More detailed information on the committee's recommendation is included with my longer written statement. CMI is a very serious condition that imposes an enormous burden of suffering on our nation's veterans. It is a very complex condition. Veterans who have CMI often have a combination of physical symptoms and cognitive symptoms, along with comorbid syndromes such as chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and irritable bowel syndrome. Other clinical entities, such as depression and anxiety, may occur as well. There's no consensus among physicians, researchers, and others as to the cause of CMI. The range of unexplained symptoms experienced by people who have CMI could result from multiple factors, but the etiology remains unknown. We didn't attempt to identify the causes of CMI. As laid out in the charge, we evaluated treatments for CMI and made recommendations for improving health care for veterans who have this condition. We conducted an extensive systematic assessment and review of the evidence on treatment for CMI. We also assessed treatments for a number of related and comorbid conditions to determine whether any of those treatments may be beneficial for CMI. Based on our assessment, we cannot recommend any specific therapy as a treatment for veterans who have CMI. We concluded that a one-size-fits-all approach is not effective for managing these veterans. We recommend that the VA implement a system-wide, integrated, multimodal long-term management approach. In our report, we make a number of additional recommendations aimed at identifying veterans who have CMI, bringing them into the VA healthcare system, and improving the quality of their care. The VA should commit the necessary resources to ensure that veterans complete a comprehensive health examination immediately upon separation from active duty. To improve coordination of care, the results should become part of a veteran's health record and should be made available to every clinician caring for the veteran, whether in or outside the VA healthcare system. Additionally, the VA should include in its electronic health record a pop-up screen to prompt clinicians to ask questions to ascertain whether a patient has symptoms consistent with CMI. Once a veteran has been identified as having CMI and has entered the VA healthcare system, the next step is to provide comprehensive care for the veteran, not only for CMI, but also for any comorbid conditions. Existing VA programs, such as post-deployment patient-aligned care teams or PACs, could be adapted to best serve veterans who have CMI. The VA should commit the resources needed to ensure that PACs have the time and the skills required to meet the needs of veterans who have CMI as specified in the Veterans Integrated Personal Care Plans. That the adequacy of time for clinical encounters is measured routinely, and that clinical caseloads are adjusted in response to the data. A major determinant of the VA's ability to manage veterans who have CMI is the training of clinicians and teams of professionals in providing care for these patients. The VA should designate CMI champions to serve as an internal resource at each VA medical center. These individuals should be integrated into the care system to ensure clear communication and coordination among clinicians. The VA also should develop peer networks to introduce new information, norms, and skills related to managing veterans who have CMI. Finally, many studies on treatments for CMI reviewed by the committee have methodological flaws. Therefore, future studies funded and conducted by the VA to assess treatments for CMI should adhere to well-accepted methodologic and reporting guidelines for clinical trials. We can't emphasize that too much. We identified several interventions that may hold promise for treatment of CMI. Although this is not an exhaustive list, the VA should consider funding and conducting studies of interventions such as biofeedback, acupuncture, aerobic exercise, and multimodal therapies. Numerous opportunities exist for the VA to improve and expand its healthcare services for veterans who have CMI. Our veterans deserve the very best healthcare. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. I certainly would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rossoff. Mr. Hardy, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for today's hearing, and thank you to Gulf War veterans who are here or are watching from home or from the hospital in the case of at least one. I myself am a veteran of the 1991 Gulf War as well as Somalia and 4 other deployments. I developed health issues that began in the Gulf that have plagued me ever since. My experiences are far from unique, and we now know roughly 1 in 3 of us Gulf War veterans are similarly afflicted. In 2010, a landmark IOM report confirmed what we Gulf War veterans already knew. Gulf War illness is likely the result of environmental agents plus other factors. It's not psychiatric, and it's likely that treatments and preventions can be found. Though such a renewed national effort has not yet fully happened, special thanks to Congressman Miller, Michaud, and Rowe, and others for helping fund the Gulf War Illness CDMRP, the only federal research program in the last 2 decades aimed at improving the health and lives of us ill Gulf War veterans. I provide more detail in my written statement. VA's past research, Gulf War research failures have previously been well documented, much of it focused on stress, psychological and other irrelevant issues. little of it aimed at developing Gulf War illness treatments. As we just heard from Dr. Coughlin, such failures have not been by accident. VA staff misdeeds continued with the recent IOM treatments committee. And last year, as we also have already heard, VA staff effectively killed a first-of-its-kind strategic plan finally aimed at improving the health and lives of veterans suffering from Gulf War illness. VA staff unilaterally whitewashed the plan. Participants, including myself, felt betrayed and having wasted a year and a half. The Research Advisory Committee, in which I serve, unanimously rejected VA's whitewash, declared no confidence in VA's handling of Gulf War illness research, and described even more issues. Secret VA cuts to the Gulf War illness research budget, VA staff misrepresentations to VA leadership and Congress, blatant violation of statutory mandates, prioritizing research not on treatments but on, quote, whether Gulf War veterans' illnesses are linked to Gulf War service. And the RAC has not been allowed to hold a public meeting since then. There are more issues, with details in my written submission. VA staff have initiated a process to create a new case definition for Gulf War illness via a literature review, unprecedented from what I'm told, and in opposition to the strategic plan mentioned earlier. VA staff refused to provide the RAC with more information. VA's medical surveillance of serious Gulf War health outcomes remains broken. VA refuses to implement a 2008 law mandating an MS prevalence study. VA is still not doing obvious infectious disease workups, as exhibited by a recent Iraq War veteran who, after a 4-year battle, was finally diagnosed and treated with Q fever. VA's Gulf War task force includes only VA staff. It operates in secret, and it asks for but ignores veterans' input. VA has failed to publish its quarterly Gulf War and OEF newsletters and claims data reports since 2010. VA continues to exclude Gulf War veterans whose service was in Turkey or Israel. VA continues to exclude from Gulf War veterans benefits Afghanistan War veterans, yet includes Iraq War veterans. VA still hasn't fixed rating problems for fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, with up to 100% ratings for one, but only 40% ratings for both. Yes, you heard that right. And these conditions are presumptive for Gulf War and Iraq veterans, but not Afghanistan veterans. DoD and VA continue to find no evidence for other serious military health issues like burn pits, vaccination injuries, and more. VA staff routinely ignore Congress, the law, and expert advisors, wasting more precious years, squandering experts' time and energy, and further alienating not just their most engaged advisors, but also the very Gulf War veterans they're supposed to be helping. Most importantly of all, VA still has no proven effective treatments for Gulf War illness patients who walk through VA's doors. Where they frequently are still thought to be psychosomatic, VA has only Band-Aids for symptoms and to help cope. Today, we are hearing why. I encourage this body to help right these ongoing wrongs, including comprehensive legislation to help force solutions, reallocation of funding from these non-performing entities, further investigation of their misdeeds, and criminal sanctions for such behavior. We Gulf War veterans have been fighting with VA and DoD for what's right for most of the last 22 long years. We've had countless congressional hearings like this one on Gulf War veterans issues, with more empty VA promises. We've seen laws passed only to see VA staff circumvent them or ignore them with impunity. I hope today's hearing will be different. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, members of the committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, and thanks so much for your service to our country. Doctor, and if you all could do your best to keep your questions down to a minimum in terms of time, so we can get to the second panel, and our ranking member has questions as well as I do. Dr. Coughlin, your written testimony stated that, quote, on the rare occasions when embarrassing study results are released, data are manipulated to make them unintelligible, unquote. Please explain and cite an example.
Examples can be cited. The best example that comes to mind is we set out to analyze data from the National Health Study for New Generation U.S. Veterans, looking at self-reported exposure to burn pits, oil well fire smoke, other inhalational hazards in relation to physician-diagnosed asthma and bronchitis. The initial exploratory analyses, which were produced by the writing group and the statistician, showed that a sizable percentage of the deployed veterans had been exposed to burn pit smoke. And burn pit fumes were associated with asthma and chronic bronchitis. Then, in a later iteration of the tabulated results, those results were set aside or discarded, and the focus was instead on deployment status in relation to asthma and bronchitis. Well, those 30,000 deployed vets and 30,000 non-deployed vets included veterans who served on ships in the Indian Ocean or in the Philippines or in Germany in hospitals. In other words, people were deployed to OEF and served in the War on Terror, but were never in Iraq or Afghanistan on the ground and had no potential exposure to burn pits. So the way that the refined results were tabulated, it obscured rather than highlighted the associations of interest. And I could elaborate if you would like.
Okay. Mr. Hardy, can you explain, in your opinion, why the Research Advisory Committee believes why the Research Advisory Committee in their latest Institute of Medicine report is flawed?
Yes, thank you for that question. First, I want to recognize that I believe that the researchers, distinguished researchers like the gentleman sitting next to me who served on that committee, were well-intentioned. However, VA staff issued a scope of work and committee charge that radically diverged from the law, that effectively prevented, and also effectively prevented what the committee could consider. I believe that these helped to prevented the IOM committee from meeting the expectations of the law. VA staff directed the panel to do a literature review rather than as the law directed, focusing on physicians experienced in treating Gulf War illness. VA staff knew little such literature exists because VA's 2 decades of failures to develop treatments have helped to ensure that fact. Additionally, most of the presenters to the panel focused on psychosomatic issues, stress as cause, and things like relaxation therapies as treatments. Ill Gulf War veterans who called in to listen to that meeting were naturally outraged. VA staff were among the presenters to the committee, including at least one sitting here today. VA staff muddied the waters by directing IOM to include not just 91 Gulf War veterans as the law directs, but many others. And finally, all of this involvement by VA staff is a far cry from previous claims that these panels operate independent of biasing influence from the contracting agency.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Dr. Rossoff, the law required that VA's agreement with the Institute of Medicine was to, quote, convene a group of medical professionals who are experienced in treating individuals who served, unquote, in the Southwest Asia Theater of Operations of the Persian Gulf War during 1990 or 1991, and who have been diagnosed with chronic multi-symptom illness or another health condition related to such service, unquote. Of the members of your committee, how many have experience in medically treating Gulf War veterans?
For members of my committee who had experience, but all the members of the committee had experience in dealing with chronic multi-symptom illness, some directly with the veterans who served in those theaters of war. In addition, there are members of the committee, including myself, that have been on other IOM committees that have dealt with the issues of Gulf War, chronic multi-symptom illness, or illnesses of that sort. So there was considerable expertise sitting around the table, in addition to methodological expertise to evaluate the literature on best treatments.
Thank you. Ranking Member Kirkpatrick.
Mr. Hardy, can you enlighten the committee on the role of the Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War illness in the preparation of a major survey of Gulf War era veterans that Dr. Coughlin was talking about in his testimony? Were the recommendations that the Research Advisory Committee made regarding the changes to the survey ignored? And what has happened to the survey?
Thank you very much for that question, Madam Ranking Member. The Research Advisory Committee made a number of recommendations early on in when the committee first became aware of that the survey existed. Many of those Office of Public Health staff, including Dr. Aaron Schneiderman that was mentioned earlier, refused to provide the Research Advisory Committee with answers to whether or not that the requested changes had been made, if any changes had been made, refused even to tell our chairman where his office was so the chairman could come and have a private meeting with him. And I was frankly shocked, and candidly, I expressed at that meeting that I hadn't seen such a display of arrogance and insolence, and that I thought that he should be fired. I was absolutely shocked. And so my understanding, when we finally saw the survey that went out, the expert, I'm simply a Gulf War veteran on the panel that's had a lot of experience with these things, but I look to many of the scientists that I find to be brilliant and experts in their field, and had put together a comprehensive survey list and focusing on the important issues to Gulf War veterans, like frankly, Gulf War illness issues. And it did not appear that those issues were being included in the survey. And when we finally saw the survey, it was extremely troubling that much of it was focused on psychological and psychiatric issues. Frankly, it was extremely upsetting for Gulf War veterans.
Do you know where the survey is now?
I think that others may be better suited to answer that question.
Dr. Coughlin.
The Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Illness provided scientific critiques as part of the formal Office of Management and Budget's regulatory process. We published an announcement in the Federal Register as required by O&B about this national data collection, and the public can indeed provide written comments, which VA is obligated to respond to. The false statements and other ethical problems that I mentioned in my testimony, those problems may well have compromised the integrity of the O&B regulatory process. So I just wanted to reinforce Mr. Hardy's comments.
Thank you. This question is for the entire panel. What do you believe are the top 3 challenges the VA faces in addressing the inadequacy of the Gulf War veterans research programs and the lack of effective treatment? So what are the 3 reasons, the challenges that they're unable to address this? Dr. Steele?
Yes, thank you. I briefly outlined that in my testimony, and I can just summarize them very quickly. The top reasons have to do with lack of expertise in this area among the people who are designing and executing the program. So it's almost as if they're designing a program that is well suited to the mid-1990s, soon after the Gulf War, when we didn't know anything about Gulf War illness. But a lot has changed since then. We've learned a lot, and certainly there's a lot of scientific promise now and scientific information now that could be built on to develop an effective research program to address Gulf War illness, as the Department of Defense has done in recent years. So it's partially the lack of expertise. It almost appears to be the lack of will, just in looking at how Gulf War illness is typically portrayed on VA websites and VA literature, how the studies appear to be designed to actually ignore Gulf War illness for the most part, or minimize it as an important problem. So some of it probably has to do with political will, and some of it has to do with expertise. But I will also say that just the use of funding is totally inappropriate. So much of the funding is used for studies that have nothing to do with Gulf War veterans or Gulf War illness. And so, it's sort of a 3-pronged problem: lack of expertise, lack of intention to address the problem, and misallocation of funds.
Thank you, Doctor. And Mr. Chairman, I've almost used up my time, so I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. Dr. Rossoff, on the monitors in this room, there are slides from 5 presentations from different speakers who appeared before your committee on February 29th of last year. As you can see, these speakers appear to be giving the committee the message that this illness is psychiatric, stress, PTSD, and so forth. Who selected these speakers to present to the committee?
Let me correct some of the statements that were made initially. The selection of the speakers to the committee was done by our committee. It was not done, as indicated previously, by Dr. Peterson or any other individual. It was selected by our committee. The committee wanted to better understand the treatment modalities that would affect positively the veterans and their health. We reviewed,
Excuse
identified...
me, one thing. Did VA or DOD have any input into the choice of these speakers?
The committee made the decision on what speakers to choose. Clear understanding on the part of the committee. But we reviewed, in addition, 6,541 unique references in enabling us to make some decisions about the treatment of veterans. So our conclusions were not based solely on the people who you saw. In addition, there were others. And if you read if our report is read clearly, you can see our conclusions were not that this was a psychological or psychosomatic disorder. We clearly make the statement, we do not know the etiology. No one treatment will be able to affect positively the treatment for patients with CMI, chronic multi-symptom illness. It requires a group of physicians, a team-based approach who understand the patient, who enable the patient to have a decision in the care he or she receives, and at the same time better understand the satisfaction of the veterans in their care. We strongly believe that this is an illness that has and requires a multimodal therapeutic intervention.
Dr. Coughlin, on October 23rd, this subcommittee asked VA how many veterans have self-identified as suicide and later committed suicide in the follow-up study of a national cohort of Gulf War and Gulf era veterans. On February 19th, VA responded stating, quote, VA has no evidence to date that any veteran in the study has committed suicide, unquote. Are these the same results you saw in your study?
Yes, fortunately, we did not lose any of the research participants. As I mentioned in my testimony, my efforts to identify mental health professionals, get involved with the study as co-investigators to place these callbacks to vulnerable research participants were initially blocked by my supervisors, and that's why I contacted the IRB chair in writing and also the VA Office of Inspector General. After a delay of 2 or 3 months, we were able to start the callback process, and a team of mental health professionals at the Washington, D.C. VA Medical Center did a fantastic job of reaching out to the veteran. We had vets who had been told by their local VA clinic or hospital that they were not eligible for free health care. But when they called the toll-free number and reached somebody in VBA in the VA central office, they were told the opposite. So the social workers were able to sort this out and get them into health care. These were vulnerable veterans, men and women, who had major depression or other medical and psychiatric conditions, and they needed assistance to get into health care to save their lives.
Thank you. Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, any other questions or before we go to the next panel?
Any other questions I'll submit in writing in the interest
Very well.
of time.
Our thanks to the panel. You're now excused. Thank you very much for your testimony. I now invite the second panel to the witness table. On this panel, we will hear from Dr. Victoria Davey, Chief Officer of VHA's Office of Public Health and Environment Hazards. Dr. Davey is accompanied by Dr. Maureen McCarthy, Deputy Chief of VHA's Patient Care Services Office, Dr. Stephen Hunt, Director of VA's Post-Deployment Care Initiative, Dr. Gavin West, Acting Chief Medical Officer of the Salt Lake City VAMC and Special Assistant in the Office of the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health for Clinical Operations, and Mr. Tom Murphy, Director of VBA's Compensation Service. Dr. Davey, your complete written statement will be made part of the hearing record, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to submit my written testimony for the record. I'm accompanied today by Dr. Stephen Hunt, who flew overnight to be here today because he didn't want to cancel his clinic appointments yesterday, Dr. Maureen McCarthy, and Dr. Gavin West, as well as Mr. Tom Murphy. The three physicians I just referenced have extensive experience treating Gulf War veterans. Mr. Chairman, this is our message. VA has learned a great deal about identifying, diagnosing, and treating Gulf War veterans over the past 22 years. We will continue to improve our abilities to provide world-class health care for Gulf War veterans, better educate our health care providers, and possibly most of all, in reference to the speakers that preceded me, expand the evidence base for the treatments we provide for these veterans, indeed for all veterans. Let me provide you with a summary of where we are. We agree with Dr. Steele. As you know, a debilitating cluster of medically unexplained symptoms affects many Gulf War veterans. We refer to the illness that these veterans have as chronic multisymptom illness, or CMI. Our present thinking is that a complex combination of environmental exposures and individual genetic characteristics may be behind this illness. Veterans with CMI, like all veterans enrolled for VA care, receive personalized, proactive, patient-driven care. In addition, VA offers a number of programs and services uniquely designed to meet the needs of Gulf War veterans with CMI. VA links our patient-aligned care teams, or PAC teams, working with Gulf War veterans with specialty care capability that focuses on treating the unique health requirements of these veterans. The program includes teaching aids, referral networks, and other types of collaboration. Frontline clinicians have been educated through a monthly community of practice conference calls, informational messages, pocket cards, and websites. Another program specifically for Gulf War veterans is our registry program, which offers a health examination at any of our health care facilities to any veteran with Gulf War service. To date, about 130,000 Gulf War veterans have undergone a registry exam. The comprehensive health exam includes an exposure and medical history, laboratory tests, and a physical exam. VA health professionals discuss the results face-to-face with veterans. This provides us an opportunity to partner with the veteran to develop an individualized care plan. An individual is very important to this discussion. Since 2001, the War-Related Illness and Injury Study Centers of the VA Office of Public Health, known as the RISCs, have supported specialized care for Gulf War veterans and conducted cutting-edge research, clinical education, and a veteran referral program. VA's 3 RISCs have teams of clinicians ready to evaluate Gulf War veterans with deployment-related concerns. Based on a comprehensive evaluation, the RISC team develops an individual, holistic treatment plan for veterans with CMI or other ill-defined conditions through a referral process based on geographic location. VA's Office of Public Health holds quarterly conference calls with environmental health coordinators and clinicians throughout VA. The calls provide coordinators and clinicians with ongoing training and allows them to share patient questions, challenges, administrative issues, and solutions that have come up at their facilities. VA recently engaged the Institute of Medicine, as you heard, to convene a committee to comprehensively review, evaluate, and summarize the available scientific and medical literature regarding the best treatments for CMI among Gulf War veterans. The report, as you heard, was released on January 23rd. IOM made recommendations to VA in 5 categories, including how to treat CMI, how to improve in systems of care and management of care, how to provide information about care, improve the collection and quality of data on care outcomes and satisfaction with care, and how to conduct future research. VA is already taking actions, and these include a program to provide every service member with a healthcare assessment upon separation from service. Improvements in systems of care and management of CMI in Gulf War veterans, including the use of clinical reminders and streamlined consults for specialty care. And the innovative PACT program I described earlier that integrates and coordinates personalized care for Gulf War veterans. We are improving communication among VA health providers and between them and the patients they care for. We are modifying our patient satisfaction measurement tools and training our staff to better recognize CMI. We are also developing a champions program and webinars on this subject and taking steps to strengthen our research protocols. Mr. Chairman, we appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you this important issue. We are proud to continue evaluation and treatment for the 700,000 deserving men and women who served in Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. My colleagues and I are prepared to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davey. Is Gulf War illness a psychological condition?
Gulf War illness is not a psychological condition. Gulf War illness is a group of chronic multi-symptom, multiple symptoms. We do not believe that it's psychological.
Dr. Hunt, I understand you made a presentation to the IOM Treatment Committee on the topic, quote, VA approaches to the management of chronic multi-symptom illness in Gulf War I veterans, unquote. The slide you presented to the committee shows that some VA doctors think Gulf War illness is, quote, mostly a physical disorder, unquote, and some think it's, quote, mostly a mental disorder, unquote. However, this information is from an 11-year-old paper. The current VA treatment guidelines revised in 2011 state, quote, that chronic multi-symptom illness is real and cannot be reliably ascribed to any known psychiatric disorder, unquote. I understand that you served on the committee that wrote the new guidelines, Dr. Hunt, but you didn't present the new guidelines to the committee. In speaking on VA approaches to the management of chronic multi-symptom illness in Gulf War I veterans, why did you tell the committee the 11-year-old information that it might be physical or it might be mental, but didn't tell the committee VA's current guideline that clearly state it's not mental?
Actually, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And I want to also acknowledge the service of all of our veterans here, and particularly our Gulf War veterans. This slide was used to illustrate when Gulf War veterans first started coming back. The psychologist and I, who ended up starting the first Gulf War Veterans Clinic at VA Puget Sound, were noticing that people were coming in with a lot of symptoms, a lot of physical symptoms of different sorts, that we would do lots of tests for, and we couldn't find a disease to link up to the symptom. And so we knew we were facing something that ultimately now we're calling chronic multi-symptom illness. At that time, we were describing it as medically unexplained symptoms. We knew that we needed a new model of care. And the way that we sort of established that was by doing a survey of providers at that time, when people were early on in the process of coming back. And so we asked the medical providers, do you think this Gulf War illness is more of a physical condition or more of a mental health condition? The medical, and we asked mental health providers, do you think it's more of a physical condition or a mental health condition? These were providers at VA Puget Sound, VA Portland, and Walter Reed. These are good clinicians, smart clinicians that know what they're doing. What this showed to me, and the point that I was trying to make, was our paradigm wasn't working, because our medical provider said, gosh, I'm doing these tests and they're all negative, so I can't find a disease here, so maybe we should have them checked out by behavioral health. Behavioral health people would look at them and say, gosh, there's all these symptoms, but they don't really meet criteria for any mental health diagnosis. I think they have some condition. I think we should send them back to their medical provider for more tests. This is the dilemma of chronic multi-symptom illness, and this is why we really appreciate the work that IOM has done in framing this thing for us in a bigger way, because our old paradigm, is it physical or is it mental, does not work. We needed a paradigm where we said, look, you've been off to war, your health has been changed in a number of ways, We appreciate your service. We're glad you're here. And the way that we're going to address this is by having a medical provider, mental health provider, social worker, kind of put your care together in a way that will
Dr.
address.
Hunt, do you think it's a mental condition or a physical condition?
I think it's a health condition. And I don't think in mental health, physical health.
Is it mental or is it physical?
It's a physical condition. And it has, our minds and bodies can't be split up in that way. I certainly would not say it's a mental condition or a psychological condition for sure. It's a health condition that we need to be very circumspect in our way of evaluating and treating.
Dr. Davey, the law required the VA's agreement with the Institute of Medicine was to, quote, convene a group of medical professionals who are experienced in treating individuals who served, unquote, in the Southeast Asia Theater of Operations of the Persian Gulf War during 1990 and 1991, unquote. But in looking at this statement of work, VA tasked IOM to, quote, review, evaluate, and summarize the available scientific and medical literature regarding the best treatments for chronic multi-symptom illness among Gulf War veterans, unquote. Why did VA change the methodology of the congressionally mandated study?
In our statement of work, we asked the IOM to convene a group of medical professionals. That's absolutely right. And to do the work around the kernel of the existing research. Inherent in that, certainly intended, was that those medical professionals would bring their clinical research expertise to the table, and as we know, experience, and clinical experience in particular, is one form of knowledge that we know, as is knowledge from research studies. We expected that those professionals would have discussions based on their experience as well as the research.
And why weren't the findings of this research published for peer review purposes?
You may be referring to Dr. Coughlin's comments about some of our research in the Office of Public Health, the large epidemiologic studies. When you do a study such as a survey with scores of questions, you collect much data, and you prioritize in an analysis plan which analyses are going to take place first. Those analyses do take place in order, and we do carry them out.
Why does it appear that there's been a misappropriation of funds appropriated for the purpose of research for Gulf War illness that seems to be diverted for other purposes?
Mr. Chairman, that's a question for my research colleagues, and I would like to take that one for the record. We are not prepared here to talk about research funding.
Very well. Ranking Member Kirkpatrick.
Dr. Davey, in your testimony, you state that the VA is now in the process of developing additional innovative training resources, such as mobile devices and internet applications. After 22 years, this seems a bit late to just now be developing applications for the environmental exposure symptoms and conditions. So when did this process begin, and when do you think you'll be able to roll it out to veterans so that it might be helpful?
Well, to speak to your larger question, the care and treatment that we have learned, and we are experts in the care of veterans, have taken place over the course of 22 years because that's what time it takes. We have to understand what we're dealing with, and it's taken that amount of time. With regard to the specific innovative tools, obviously, since the technology's been available, but let me refer to Dr. West, who's developing one of the internet applications or the mobile app.
Please, Dr. West.
Comment more.
Well, thank you so much. I'm actually a primary care physician and a general internist by trade, and I'm proud to say that every day I take full, care of Gulf War veterans and all veterans, and it's really my privilege. To answer that question directly, we have already developed a lot of these tools. In fact, in your packet, you have one of them. It's the pocket card. I don't know if you guys have looked at it, which has essentially a lot of what Dr. Steele was talking about, a lot of the exposure concerns, a lot of the public health websites, webinars, and training modules that have been developed through Office of Public Health and through the VHA, as a whole. As far as getting that onto a mobile app, that's in the process. Otherwise, we've talked a little bit about the IOM pop-ups and clinical reminders for physicians, which is another computer-based application. We've already developed a type of pop-up called a clinical reminder that helps physicians, A, understand where their veterans are coming from, their service. Second, actually goes through the chronic multi-system illness and lays that out in a way that they can kind of follow a simple screen, answer questions, and better adequately answer the veterans' questions. I mean, that's a key. I mean, these tools are really important to train providers, to get them out on the front lines. Again, I see patients every day in clinic.
And let me just interrupt quickly. I understand that, but my concern is how do we communicate to veterans so that they may get the resources they need? And the mobile apps, I know, are in the process, but do you have a timeline for when you're going to roll that out, when that's actually going to be available to veterans so they can learn about it?
I don't have an exact timeline for the Veterans Communication app, so I'd have to take that back for the record.
Okay, could you get back to me on that? I think it's
absolutely.
really essential. One of the things that I realize is it seems like the VA is always a little behind on this, and it's been 22 years. And so, I really would like to have some benchmarks, some timetables, so that we can report to our veterans that we're moving forward with that. With this. And Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I'm going to yield back. I know we're going to have votes here in just a second.
Mr. Murphy, in a recent request for information, VA responded to this committee that they could not provide the total number of Gulf War era veterans who were in receipt of service-connected disability benefits for CMI because VBA does not have a diagnostic code to identify only CMI-related claims, and it could not be separated from other undiagnosed illnesses. Other than CMI, what other undiagnosed illnesses does VA award service-connected benefits for?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have the answer to that question, but I can tell you that they are covered under a group of undiagnosed illnesses, which makes it very difficult without literally sitting down and going through file page by page, veteran by veteran to come in.
No, I think the question is what other undiagnosed illnesses are there that benefits are awarded for, other than CMI?
That's one I have to take for the record. I don't have an answer.
You don't know?
No, sir, I do not.
Okay. I want that information.
Yes, sir.
If you are awarded if you are awarding service connection for other undiagnosed illnesses, then why does 38 CFR 3.317, referring to the statute regulation, the only regulation which explicitly mentions undiagnosed illness and CMI, and in fact is labeled, quote, compensation for disability due to undiagnosed illness and medically unexplained chronic multi-symptom illness, unquote, specifically state that it applies to Persian Gulf veterans, defining both that phrase and the phrase, quote, Southwest Asia Theater of Operations, unquote, within the regulation.
I don't understand the question, Mr. Chairman.
Why don't we take that one for the record?
Okay.
Why doesn't VA have a specific diagnostic code to evaluate CMI? Is this something that is being looked into as part of the current rating schedule revision that is taking place?
Yes, absolutely. Under the Vassar D rewrite project, this is absolutely being considered as a change because the entire volume in its entirety is under rewrite.
And Mr. Chairman, there's kind of been a shift because the IOM report really has characterized this thing using the term and the kind of the nomenclature, chronic multi-symptom illness. Up until this point, we've been using different nomenclature, medically unexplained or undiagnosed illnesses. It's the same symptoms, and it's almost any physical symptom a person can have that a person can get service connected for, a Gulf War veteran. It's just that now we're calling chronic multi-symptom illness, and there's some debate about how do we create a case definition for exactly what that means. Originally, we said fatigue, idiopathic pain, and cognitive disturbances. Those were the three main ones. But then we started seeing bowel symptoms. We started seeing other neurological symptoms. So then they said really any symptom a person has. And now it's a new kind of characterization of it. It's not a new term, but now we're saying, look, this is chronic multi-symptom illness. This is the way we can get our arms around it and really start treating it more effectively.
Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, any final questions or comments? Thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for testifying, both panels for testifying today. I want to say as a Gulf War veteran, I find the conduct of the Veterans Administration embarrassing on this issue in terms of their treatment of veterans. I have to ask you, is anybody a Gulf War veteran that's on this panel right now? You know, I think if there was one, or if there were Gulf War veterans in senior positions in the Veterans Administration, I don't think we'd be here today. Yeah, we need to write those questions a little bit better. Yeah, they gotta bring it down a little bit.